At last, a voice for those who pay big government's bills, not the ones who create big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio. I am your host, Pete Sepp.
And Natasha, Altamirano.
Welcome to this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. First up on our agenda, tax increases, something we all ought to be worried about in this slow economy. And unfortunately, after sending some signals that his economic advisors had decided against it, Barack Obama appears to be ready to propose more increases in income taxes, investment taxes, perhaps even excise taxes on top of what he's already signed into law. What's the threat looking like on the horizon, Natasha?
Well, I just think it's interesting because during his presidential address last week, he said that he is not a fan of big government, yet here he is proposing all these new tax increases. For example, his new budget proposes another sneaky way to increase the top tax rate without appearing to actually raise the rate. This isn't a change, but it's just politics as usual.
Yes. One way that Obama plans to raise taxes, besides the two obvious increases in the top rate and the rate below that, is taking away the value of itemized deductions that people can claim on their tax returns, thereby reducing the income that's subject to tax. He would phase those out on what he calls high-income taxpayers. Of course, when you look back in history, the phase-out for itemized deductions was a way of raising taxes during the administration of George H.W. Bush. So this is a Republican as well as a Democratic problem, and it is a sneaky way of raising taxes. If you restrict a person's ability to take certain deductions or credits, it means that more of your income will be on the chopping block. More of it will be subject to tax. That's a tax increase, even though rates themselves might be taking a different direction. Unfortunately, the rates will be taking a new direction and a different one for people who are unfortunate enough to be making more than $200,000 a year. I say unfortunate because you are facing the expiration of the Bush tax rate reductions after 2010. You're facing a new 20% tax rate on capital gains and dividends. That's up from about 15% or 10%, depending on which tax bracket you're in. There may also be gasoline tax increases. Recently, a Transportation Department panel recommended that perhaps the federal government should continue to examine weight distance taxes. That means instead of levying a flat tax on each gallon of gas you buy, you would be charged for how many miles you drive and the weight and size of your car. Well, those concepts are interesting, but when politicians get into the mix, who knows how high they'll make the rates? They certainly will want to raise more revenue than what the gas tax is raising now, and there's no promise in the world that can be enacted to keep them from retaining the gas tax we have now as well as a weight distance tax. That would be a disaster for American motorists.
And something else that happens is a lot of times these taxes are levied with a specific project in mind, transportation funding or improving infrastructure, yet they end up going toward different projects, earmarks, and other wasteful spending. Isn't that right, Pete?
Oh, absolutely. And the trend actually continues at the state level. In Oregon, for example, there's a lot of outrage among citizens who have been paying special taxes for certain kinds of services, among them additional charges on their mobile phone bills in order to fund new programs to upgrade emergency services, 911 services. Unfortunately, the government there has said, we can decide where we want the money to go. We need to plug a budget hole, so we're going to take the proceeds from the 911 tax, stick it in our general budget, call the budget balanced, and leave town. Obviously, consumers have a different view there, and they were sold a bill of goods. Hopefully, activists in Oregon can overturn this ridiculous practice of raiding trust funds. There is, of course, a very straightforward proposal to make the research and experimentation tax credit permanent For those of you who may not be in the corporate world, the R&E tax credit is a very valuable way that companies can engage in research for new products or services and write that off on their taxes. It's one way that America still retains a small advantage in corporation income taxes because the overall rates are terrible compared to the rest of the world. But there's also what is called the Making Work Pay tax credit. That is, I guess, by definition, if you are to believe the president, you have to work and you have to get paid in order to get the tax credit. Oops, not necessarily the case because of the $278.6 billion in new tax cuts for families and individuals over the next 5 years that he proposes. 42% of these cuts will be refundable. The term refundable means you can still get a tax cut even though you don't pay taxes, even if the amount you would get back exceeds your actual tax liability. You still get the full tax credit. And refundable is counted as an outlay in the federal budget, an expenditure, because obviously, again, this is going to people who are not necessarily paying higher taxes. It is welfare. And 40%, more than 40% even, is the refundable portion of Obama's $278.6 billion tax cut. A true travesty for those of us who pay big government's bills and have to go through that in our paychecks or our Social Security checks every week. But there you have it. And in this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000 member National Taxpayers Union, questions about Barack Obama's budget. How much is being spent? Where's it being spent? How much are we going to pay in additional taxes? Where are the boondoggles? And with apologies to that 1970s TV show, here's the story from a man named Brady. Damian Brady, Senior Policy Analyst for the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. Welcome, Damian.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Okay. Well, Damian, what can you tell us about Obama's budget and as far as how it compares to the address he did last week? Did he get into any more detail, unveil any really big ticket items that taxpayers should be worried about?
He spoke to the nation and Congress last week, gave some hints about what he's going to do in his budget, and then this week he put out his $1 trillion budget. Amazing figures in this thing, and if you were paying any attention to what Obama talked about on the campaign, those items are what's in his budget. He talked about increasing spending for healthcare, for education, and for energy, and all that is in there in the budget. It's pretty astronomical growth in the budget over the next 5 years in outlays. Really, the only departments that he would shrink over the next 5 years are commerce, transportation, homeland security, and everything else is slated to grow by 7% or higher. The biggest areas that are going to benefit are the State Department. He's got a pretty ambitious effort to increase our aid in their national programs, and education, of course. He would like to increase federal spending and support for higher education, for Pell Grants in that area.
Interesting. One of the things I noticed are a few unrealistic assumptions. I saw that in one period early in the budget, he's assuming that outlays for Medicaid, the state-federal joint program providing health care for the poor, would decrease year over year. Now that hasn't happened in decades, and it makes you wonder, are some of these things even feasible from the start?
That's a good question to consider. Now, one thing I'll say that's really good about the budget that Obama has presented is that it's very detailed. He's very specific about where his money is coming from and where it's going to go and what all his economic assumptions are. The question is, though, is whether you can buy those economic assumptions. Are they going to be realizable as this budget is carried forth and developed by Congress? One thing that he projects is that the economy is going to grow pretty strongly over the next couple of years. He's generating a growth in GDP that is higher by a couple of percentage points than some other people have, and so then this would significantly increase the amount of tax receipts that he is counting on for all the new spending that he has laid out. And he for the years 2010 and 2011, he's projecting pretty strong economic growth, which would increase federal receipts by 13% each year for those 2 years. And we have not seen anything nearing this since the early 1950s, where you had 2 consecutive years of double-digit growth in economic receipts. And you peel back the onion a little bit more, looking through the budget book, you see that the only time recently where we've had double-digit growth in tax receipts was after Congress passed Bush's tax cuts, which rewarded producers and wealth and encouraged people to go out and invest and grow the economy.
Fascinating. So if Obama actually wants the revenue growth he's proposing, he's got to cut taxes rather than raise them.
Right. Yeah, a lot of watchers of Wall Street on CNBC and other channels like that have been describing this as an all-out war on productivity. He's increasing taxes on investment. He's increasing taxes on capital gains. And then he's expecting to raise more and more money out of these people. And if you look at the record, this hasn't happened. Now, President Clinton went through a round where he increased tax rates for capital gains, and counting on all this extra money to be able to pour into the government, into federal programs. It didn't happen. We saw a decline in the receipts brought from this. And then he went along with the Republicans to actually cut these taxes, and that's when they saw the growth. That's when you saw the stock market start to take off. So the stock market and the economy responds a lot to these high-level taxes that are being talked about.
I noticed one rather bizarre item that you were able to uncover, that the budget is assuming savings from fewer children being born?
That's right. He has laid out all kinds of savings that he expects to get from Medicaid and Medicare. And as you just brought up in your last question, it's not too common to actually see a decrease in Medicaid spending from year to year. But he does count on $110 million savings for Medicaid by increasing spending for family planning. So what this means is that they'll be able to enact this family planning, more birth control, more abortions, however it's carried out. There's going to be fewer children, and there will be fewer children on welfare. So they're counting that as a savings, and that's a really cynical way of trimming the budget.
Well, certainly sounds like it. And speaking of kids, the tab to our children of the national debt and the additional spending that will be required to fulfill this budget plan are simply astronomical. I think I saw that over the next 5 years, publicly held debt of the United States of America will double. That is incredible during a period of peacetime.
You are absolutely correct, and these figures don't necessarily translate very well on radio, but they're very important figures that all taxpayers should be aware of. We currently owe about $5.8 trillion in our publicly held debt. That's debt held by citizens of our country and nations abroad, China, for instance. And over the next couple of years, this debt is going to increase to $11.5 trillion by 2013. How are we going to sustain this? We're not going to be able to definitely sustain this with these low interest rates that we've had over the next couple of years. People are going to continue to want to buy federal treasury bonds. They're going to demand a higher return on their payments. So this is going to have another broad ramification for the economy.
Yeah, I guess on a per person basis, $12 trillion would boil down to something on the order of $35,000, $36,000 per head. That's just incredible. Now, there are a few spending reductions contained in Obama's budget, but they are indeed few and they're far between. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Right. If you heard his address to the nation at the joint session of Congress, he said that he and his budget people have already identified $2 trillion in savings from the federal budget. But when he talks about a savings in the budget, he doesn't mean what you and I think of as a savings in the budget. I would think of, okay, he's gonna axe this program, he's gonna save some money over here by getting maybe some more people off welfare. But no, he's counting the tax increases that will happen by allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire. He's counting that as the budgetary savings. Now, I guess this will bring in more budget funding for his spending proposals, but this is not a savings. Another savings that he has touted in his budget assumes that the Bush level spending in Iraq and Afghanistan would continue for the next 10 years. And he's coming up with, and this is rounding up to about $150 billion a year over the next 10 years. Now, this ignores the fact that Bush and the government in Iraq had already laid out a plan last fall for an agreement of forces which would reduce the number of troops that we do have stationed there. And he has followed up, Obama has followed up on that and will cut the number of troops in Iraq to 50 grand in, what was it, by 2010.
Yes.
So there will be some savings there. We'll be spending about $50 billion a year as a result of the status of force agreement versus the upwards of $160 billion a year that we were spending when we were at a full level. But he assumes that we would continue the Bush level over the next 10 years, and that's not something that was going to happen. Even if Bush was still in office, he would have pursued a course. We would have less troops there as well. Same with McCain, I would reckon. So that is a little bit of smoke and mirrors in terms of the savings he's claimed.
Interesting. I also see he's proposing reductions in agricultural subsidies. That appears to be the most specific he ever gets when he's talking budget numbers. But ironically, if you look back to 1993, President Clinton at the time proposed some budgetary shifts in a document called A Vision of Change for America, and in there he was talking about reducing agricultural subsidies. This seems to be a favorite around Washington because the farm programs are generally authorized every 5 to 7 years. So if you're not in that 5th or 7th year when Congress is actually debating the farm legislation and is totally resistant to cutting any kind of subsidies, why, you get a free pass. You can say, we're going to cut farm subsidies, we're going to cut them, believe me, I promise, believe me. And then when the time comes to do it, members of Congress say, no way.
Right, that's typical when Washington tries to cut a program. The people who are going to lose the benefit of this program become very active proponents to keep it, and more so than the taxpayer who bears the burdens of all these programs. So it's very hard to get rid of spending in Washington because you have to go through Congress, and Congress will bend to the special interests and do what they say.
Yes, Bill Clinton promised creating a government that works better and costs less. Obama said virtually the same thing. We sure don't have a government that works better and costs less, and we've never really had one since, I would say, the 19th century, when we used to actually pay down war debts in peacetime and shrink the size of government. We have not done that since World War II. We've especially not done that since the Vietnam conflict, and boy, are we paying for it.
I concur.
Well, that wraps up this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, all the bad news on the federal budget. But don't worry, your National Taxpayers Union is here, ready to fight, ready to take on the big spenders where they live. And brother, we're going to do it.
Thanks for joining us, Damien, and I'm sure we'll see you again next month when Obama actually unveils his full budget, as this was just an outline.
I'll be here.
Thanks.
Riddle me this, Gimme Radio listeners. What has 3,000 pages, 9,000 earmarks, contains $410 billion of spending, and has more pork in it than a sausage factory? We're talking about the Omnibus Appropriations Bill for the remainder of fiscal year 2009. Some would call it the Ominous Appropriations Bill. And this bill is our outrage of the week. As I said, you just got the macro numbers, but what's in the details? That's something I think that most people will be shocked to find. As I mentioned, 9,000 earmarks. Here are a few of the highlights. $1.7 million for pig odor research. $2 million for the promotion of astronomy in Hawaii. The Center for Grape Genetics in New York gets $2.1 million. There's the Gene Autry National Center for the American West at $167,000. But Buffalo Bill Cody will not be outdone. He gets $190,000 for the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. beating out the $150,000 for a rodeo museum in South Dakota. How about remodeling a playground in Ottawa, Illinois? $47,500. $95,000 for Hawaii Public Radio. $95,000 as well for the state of New Mexico to find a dental school location. I'm not sure what in the world they have to search for. They could probably just use Google Maps and figure out a place where people can get their molars fixed. But what do I know? Members of Congress are so much smarter than the rest of us. All told, we are talking about tens of millions of dollars in wasteful spending, tens of billions of dollars in low priority spending, and would you believe that Senator John McCain, former presidential candidate, offered an amendment to strike these earmarks and simply continue funding the government on its current path. Rather than increasing funding 10%, just keep it where it is. That amendment to the Omnibus Appropriations Bill went down in flames. Over 60 senators voted against it. Apparently, these fellas in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives know better ways to save money than getting rid of their excessive pork barrel spending. Right, Natasha?
That's exactly right, Pete. Some members of Congress are actually implementing their own cost-cutting efforts to help deal with the recession. Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley wears layers to cut down on heating costs. Representative Eric Massa from New York, a Democrat, has installed video conferencing equipment in both his Washington and home district offices so he can have face-to-face conversations with constituents and save on travel costs. Gerald Connolly of Virginia, also a Democrat, carpools to work each morning with staff members to save money. But there are some members of Congress who are not saving money for taxpayers. This was a story in the Washington Times where I actually used to work. My friend Kara Rowland is a congressional reporter, and she was working on this story, going up to members of Congress and their staff on the Hill last week asking what they do to save money. You know, pretty harmless question, makes Democrats and Republicans look good. However, she asked Representative Elijah Cummings, a Democrat from Maryland, and he said, quote, "I've got nothing for you," which she then confirmed with his press secretary. But the worst response has to be from Barney Frank, Democrat from Massachusetts. He just said, "None of your business." And she thought he was joking. She stood there and he just repeated, "It's none of your business." So that quote is included in the story, and I think it's pretty outrageous.
Let's give a hand to Barney Frank, engineer of the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. I gotta give some credit to the folks who are trying to economize on their own in Congress. I know that sleeping on couches in their offices is not an unusual thing, but really, they could have adopted this amendment by Senator McCain and saved hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So another missed opportunity.
Go.
Well then, Gimme Radio listeners, now that you're sufficiently outraged over Congress's improper fiscal decorum, far be it from us to leave you hanging without a way to express your frustration to Capitol Hill. We now have a new service called Team Taxpayer, utilizing the latest technology to make sure Congress hears our voice. What's this all about, Natasha?
Well, if you text FIGHT to 54608 from your mobile phone, you will join NTU's Team Taxpayer. It's a text messaging advocacy service that we just launched last week, similar to our Get Active email service, only it'll be by your mobile phone, so you can just hit one button and call your representatives in Congress and state legislatures to voice your concerns on bills. We'll send you information on important votes coming up, tax hikes, tax cuts, everything from the federal to state level, and you'll be able to then just call your congressman, congresswoman. While emails are effective, we believe that phone calls, especially thousands upon thousands of calls that have the potential to shut down the Capitol switchboard, are infinitely more effective. When congressional staffers get tons of emails, it's easy for them to just delete without even reading. But this way, if you text FIGHT to 54608, you'll join NTU's team. We alert, you call, they listen.
What a great slogan. And of course, we need to remember that this is not just a thing to make life more difficult for staffers. It's not just a problem that email is too easily ignored. It's all of us out in Gimme Radio land who wonder, well, an email's good enough. I don't really want to get on the phone, maybe spend some long distance charges, maybe have to worry about time. It's so much easier to just click a button and send off an email. The problem is, members of Congress are reading emails less and less. They're setting up things like logic puzzle, requiring you to answer a question before you're allowed in to the lawmaker's server on the internet. All kinds of ways to basically shut down communication. And this is the only way texting and phone calling that is foolproof, will always get through to a live human being on the end of the phone, provided you're calling during business hours. It is always the way that senators and representatives gauge immediate public opinion about an evolving issue, because they know if you take the time, which can be less than 60 seconds, and the trouble, which now is less than simply pushing a button on your phone, if you do those things, you are committed to your cause. That's why Team Taxpayer is so important. The effort is still pretty minimal on your end, but it has a maximum impact.
And we want to emphasize that the service is free besides standard messaging cost. A lot of people now have, unlimited plans, so it doesn't cost you any additional money. But even if not, text messages range from, 5 or 10 cents or so. Once again, text FIGHT, F-I-G-H-T, to the number 54608. You'll get an auto confirmation from NTU along with more details about the service. And if you ever wish to opt out, it'll come with instructions on how to do that as well. We hope you never do, but, that's the choice we want to give people. So FIGHT 54608, join Team Taxpayer.
Well, that just about wraps it up for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers here on Gimme Radio. Just remember, listeners, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power by speaking of taxpayers. Until next week, I'm Pete Sepp.
And I'm Natasha Altamirano.